Well, welcome everyone to this quarter's Asia Religious and Ethnic Freedom workshop or webinar. The Asia Religious and Ethnic Freedom project is run by Search for Common Ground, Freedom House, USAID, and many partners that work along the way who share their expertise from across the Asian continent. So we're very excited today to be talking about effective engagement with religious actors. We have Halima Ahmed and Sharon Rosen. So thank you all again for joining us. Halima, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vanda. Thank you all for joining us this morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is, right where you are in the world. As Vanda already introduced, we're going to be talking about effective engagement with religious actors. And we want to try to make this as practical as possible. So as I go through my slides, I'm going to be sharing from some of my experiences working with religious actors, particularly on issues related to freedom of religion or belief, or gender justice, prevention of violent extremism, and other developmental issues. Yes, so I think first things first is mapping the religious landscape. As a development practitioner, an organization, NGO, individual, we looking to work with religious leaders. A lot of research of experience have already shown how much influence that religious leaders, religious actors can have on communities and the impact of faith communities in humanitarian development and peace building work. But then, for those of us who want to engage with them, sometimes we're not sure what to do, what not to do. And I think the very first thing is to identify the major religious group in whichever region you want to work with. So it is important to understand the religious landscape. So which are the major religious groups within these communities? Who are they? What are their beliefs? What does the landscape look like? Because sometimes we just look at, oh, this country has 55% Christians and 45% Muslims, for example. But perhaps the demography is so scattered such that in a particular region, it's 90% Muslim and 10% Christian. And in another region, it is 80% Muslim and 10% Christian and things like that. So those nuances need to be taken into account when you're designing your programming. In the Nigerian context, for example, the northern part of the country is majorly Muslim and minority Christian, while the southern part of the country is majorly Christian and minority Muslim. In programming, it is often useful and helpful to bring participants, especially if you're conducting a training program, for example, with religious leaders, and especially when it is interfaith. It is usually helpful from my experience we've seen to bring participants from both the north and the south together in one room, rather than bringing participants only from the north or only from the south. What we have seen is that when we bring participants from both parts of the country, where we have both Muslims and Christians being minority or majority, depending on where they come from, they are better able to empathize with one another. They are better able to see the humanity in one another. They are better able to see the similarities of the challenges that they face and together brainstorm on how to tackle those challenges. For example, perhaps Christians in the north are complaining that, oh, we're not given land to build a church. If it is just a gathering of northerners, what they would see is a we versus them kind of situation where it's like, oh, you are not giving us space to build mosque, to build churches. But when the northerners and the southerners come together, they realize, oh, just as the Christian is facing this challenge in the north, the Muslim is also having a similar challenge getting land to build mosque in the south. And then they can together work on how to address this. So this is just an example of how understanding the religious landscape and them can be important to whatever programming you want to do. Also, it's important to research the local religious practices and beliefs. So it's not enough to just know that, oh, we have Muslims here or Christians or they are Hindus or they are Sikhs or they are Buddhists. We know that within different contexts, religion and culture often mix. And so how the same religion is practiced in one part of the world is different from how it is practiced in other parts of the world. And those local practices can influence how you engage with the religious leaders within your region. So it's important not just to be aware about the religion as a whole, but also to know what are some of the nuances, what are some of the local context that you need to take cognizance of in your programming. So also, it's important to understand the internal hierarchies within this religious community. For example, while I have mentioned the importance of identifying the major religious groups, it's also important to understand that within each religious community, there are sometimes different sects and denominations, and they have different dispositions towards one another. Sometimes they are friendly, sometimes they are not as friendly, sometimes the outrights can hardly be in the same room together. And if you're not aware of some of these nuances and just bring people together in the same room who do not see eye to eye on ordinary basis without having first prep them for such kind of meetings, things can actually go south. So it's important to understand the different sects and denominations of the religious communities that you're working with, which religious actors, some religious actors can act as bridges between these various sects and denominations. And those are people that you want to make sure you have a very good relationship with, and you can tap into their resource and help your programming. Some religious actors can also be divided. So it's important to just understand some of those nuances and differences and dispositions and understand how they can affect your programming. Also, sometimes when we're working with religious actors, we're not just working with individuals, but we're also working with religious organizations. The way some religious organizations or sects have been made is just such that they have hierarchies and there are different roles and titles, and the people are occupying a particular position have the limits and boundaries of their power and authority and what they can do, and at which point they have to defer to the person above them. Sometimes they have things that they can engage with you directly with. At other times, they need to get permission from above. So just understanding the structure and knowing which role, what are the hierarchies, who is above whom, who should you be talking to, should you be engaging with, in order for you to be able to achieve what you want to achieve is really, really important. And also, it's important to understand the difference between formal and informal religious leaders, and because sometimes there are formal structures, so this is a pastor, and this is a deacons, and this is a reverend, and this is a bishop. But then there are also informal religious leaders. We have, for example, youth associations that are religious groups, and where the youth leaders are very influential. They may not have titles and positions within the hierarchy of the religious group, but they do have influence over a particular demography within that religious group. And if that is a demography that you're interested in capturing or in working with, then you want to recognize those informal religious leaders and know how to engage with them. Also, within some religious groups, because it's important that we're not dealing with just the male religious actors, but we're also working with female religious leaders. For some religions or religious organizations, there aren't women in the formal religious titles and positions and hierarchies, or women do not play very prominent role at those levels. But that does not mean that they do not have influence or they are not playing any roles within the religious space. So it's important to know, how are women playing roles within this space? How do they hold positions? How are they leaders? And who are the female religious leaders? And how do you engage with them? This is important not just to ensure that, yes, we are ticking the boxes, but really because the contribution of women in things like this cannot be overemphasized, and we need to ensure that we do not leave anyone behind. So also, as we try to work with religious actors, it might be necessary sometimes to collaborate with faith-based organizations, especially those that are local, because often they have been engaging with the religious leaders and community leaders already. They know them. So all of these things that I talked about earlier, the nuances, the demographies, the leadership structures, they are often aware of this. They are aware of the local context and all of that. So identifying and partnering with reputable faith-based organizations could actually help you to make the necessary changes that you want to make, or implement your projects, or engage more effectively with religious actors in the community. But in doing this, credibility is key. So it's important to ensure that whichever FBO you decide to work with are actually reputable and credible within the religious communities that you want to work with. Also, something else to consider, especially when you're thinking about training, of workshops, town hall meetings, anything that brings people together, is to select appropriate venues and timing for your programming. For example, you need to be conscious of religious holidays and observances, depending on the religious group that you're working with. For example, if you're working with a Muslim religious organization or group, then you do not want to fix training or engagement with imams and religious leaders in the evening of Ramadan, when traditionally they will be having tafsir sessions, or during the Hajj period that just ended recently, when you know that many of them would either be going to Hajj themselves or helping with some Hajj rites for other people going to Hajj. So that might not be a good time to fix a program. So depending on the religions you're dealing with, you have to be aware of which are the times when you should not try to engage. Also, you need to align your goals and expectations with what you want to achieve and what the faith-based organizations and religious actors can do. We have had experiences of donor organizations, institutional donors wanting to work, for example, on gender equity or equality issues, sexual rights and sexual reproductive health and rights issues. And yes, you have faith-based organizations and religious actors willing to work with them on this, but they draw the line that yes, we're going to talk about female empowerment, economic empowerment, education, healthcare, and all of that. But we're not going to promote anything related to LGBTQ. We would not do that. Or we're not going to distribute condoms to secondary school students, teenagers, and adolescents in the name of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So when you go in knowing that sometimes this demographic would have some lines that they would not cross, you need to determine for yourself what is it that you want to achieve, what are the compromises that you can make, and what are the expectations that you have of them that they can meet, and what are those that they cannot make, and you come to a compromise and agreement on that. Also, we have found it helpful to engage religious leaders themselves as trainers, as facilitators, especially when what you're doing has to do with capacity building and social and behavioral change. We have this concept of gatekeepers and doorkeepers. We believe that every religious community has its gatekeepers, who are those people that are most influential within that community, the imams, especially of Juma mosques, for example, churches, reverends, monks, people who really have a lot of influence on the community. These are your gatekeepers. These are people that you really want to ensure that you engage with, you don't lose, you get their buy-in. And also, if you're able to get those people on your side, it would be easier and more effective if you could train those people to actually be the trainers and facilitators, and to be the one passing on whatever message it is you want to pass, rather than doing it yourself at scale, because often they already have the ears of the people. We also have those we call doorkeepers. So these are people who are like gatekeepers, but do not have influence to the level of gatekeepers, but they also have some level of influence, and they should not be neglected. So this is my last slide. I'm basically just looking at different cultural sensitivities and ethical considerations that we need to bear in mind as we engage with religious leaders. So we have to respect religious customs and rituals and symbols. So this comes from awareness of what should you do and not do. As development practitioners, we need to avoid religious bias and maintain neutrality, especially when we are working with people of different religions at the same time. We should be seen as neutral and not tilting towards one side in favor of the other. We might also need to navigate sensitive topics, sometimes deal with potential conflict, particularly intra-faith. Sometimes it could be interfaith, sometimes being aware of some of the things that can come up and preempting this could really be helpful, and also understanding and following proper protocols during interactions. Like I said, some religious organizations, faith systems have hierarchies and roles and titles and how you address its eminence, its highness, and things like that that you need to be aware of and make use of when addressing them so that you're not considered being disrespectful. Lastly is the issue of dress code and behavior in religious settings. Different religious groups, different religious beliefs have different expectation of morality or dress code or decorum. So being aware of this and trying to not necessarily adopt what their faith teaches, but being sensitive to that to a large extent would help if you're going to engage with religious leaders, Muslim religious leaders in northern Nigeria, for instance, and you're a woman, even though you're not expected a hijab like I am doing, but you're expected to still wear modest clothing, not exposing any cleavage or laps and things like that. So just basic level of decency will be expected. So whatever it is that is obtainable with the religious demographic that you're dealing with, you need to be aware of this and take cognizance of this in your dress code and how you behave with people. Some religions, for example, do not allow intermingling of sexes, or you cannot shake hands with the opposite sex or have a hug, while others have no problem with it. So once you are aware of this and act accordingly, there will be less challenges, and hopefully we'll be able to engage better with religious actors. I'm going to stop here to give room for other presentations, and then I can answer questions during the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Halima, for sharing your expertise and experience. Some themes that really stuck out to me that you talked a lot about. A reminder that groups are not monolithic, that, just because people might be part of the same sort of broader religion or even sect or even group in a particular area, that individuals will have different goals, influences, expectations, things like that. I really appreciated the use gatekeepers versus doorkeepers of thinking about people's formal responsibilities and sort of gates that they can open, but then also thinking of informal influence and responsibilities, sort of thinking of those doorkeepers, and especially through a gender lens of just because women may not have formal roles in religious group, that doesn't mean that they don't have informal influence. And then the other thing that stuck out to underscore it, just of thinking of timing and location of programming and training and things like that, how that becomes especially more important when working with faith-based organizations. And then lastly, sort of thinking of more of the religious and cultural sensitivities, especially around titles, dress codes, decorum, etc., which is a really good segue to Sharon. I'll invite you up to give us more of a religious sensitivity overview. So thank you for joining us, Sharon. I'll hand you the floor.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be with you all today, even though I can't see you. I hope you're out there somewhere. I thought that I would begin with a story from when I lived in South Africa many years ago, which I think in a way reflects what we're talking about today. There was a South African taking a police cadet exam to become a community policeman. And one of the questions on the test, he was asked, "What is rabies and how do you treat it?" And his answer was, "Rabbis are Jewish priests and I treat them with respect." That's basically the overall message of this webinar in a nutshell. I wondered whether to tell a story when I can't hear the response of the audience, but I hope you're laughing. But in any event, as I had imagined, and it was so, much of what Halima said is what I had thought to say as well. So I'm going to skim over some of the things and, of course, highlight very, very quickly some of the points in order to emphasize them. But maybe before we get into how we engage religious actors for peace, perhaps a few words on why we need to do so. Over the past 8 years since I've directed religious engagement for Search for Common Ground, although in truth since long before then, I've been convinced that we must engage religious actors. men, women, young people, not only on issues relating to religion, but also the most profound issues we're grappling with in our very transitional world at the moment. Issues of migration, climate, societal changes, the role of women, artificial intelligence. So why do we engage religious actors? Two main reasons. One, Halima's already said, they are influential, particularly community religious leadership, in addition to senior leadership. 4/5 of the world identifies with a religious community, and for the majority of them, religion is a key identity marker. And the numbers are very similar for young people. In fact, Pew surveys show that religious identification is on the rise. So they can't be ignored, as has often been the case among policymakers in the West, although this attitude is changing. And secondly, while religion is not the cause of most conflicts, and the majority do have a religious dimension. So religious actors need to be included in discussions in order to help solve them. However, we do know that religion can also be a weapon of war, not just a force for peace. So we need to make sure to encourage the latter, and by doing so, reduce the former. So how do we do that? How do we engage them effectively? Well, I have 10 challenges and I have 9 recommendations for both practitioners and policymakers, and I'm sure there are more. Perhaps I'll begin with the challenges, as Halima didn't speak about this, and then try to give some direction on how to overcome them. So I'll speak in headlines, and then we will have a chance to follow up later in question time if you have questions about specific issues. And many of these challenges are linked one to the other. So first of all, we know it's best to be inclusive when striving for peace and social cohesion. So our first challenge is this imbalance of power or authority between religious actors and the lack of inclusion of women and young people, as well as others. There are strong hierarchies, as we heard from Halima, that have been in existence for thousands of years, and sometimes it feels like forever. Secondly, on the topic of inclusion, one of our biggest challenges is engaging religious actors with LGBTQI individuals and communities. For reasons that Halima also spoke about, from many religions, this way of life is considered a sin, and therefore it's very difficult for them, when it is something that they feel has been handed down by God, to actually deal with. A third challenge is the influence of a majority religion and its dominance in government and society in many countries, which results in discrimination against and exclusion of smaller religions or those with no religion at all, resulting in a lack of basic human rights, as we see in Article 18 of the Declaration of Human Rights, the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Fourthly, it is really difficult to work with religious actors who believe that God is on our side. That position where they cannot do anything wrong and whatever they believe is absolutely true. Then, as we also heard, we have intra-religious tensions, different interpretations of texts within the same religion. And 6, we have interreligious tensions. You know, interreligious dialogue is a pretty new phenomenon. It's basically only a couple of generations old, and we are feeling our way forward on this, even though actually in the last 20 years there's been a dramatic move forward in many places, but not in all by any means. There are complications of providing for special dietary and other religious needs. Again, we heard about this before. But there's also a problem of instrumentalization of both religious actors and decision makers, both by religious actors and by decision makers, using the other side in order to get what they want from policies or for their own communities. And there is also now more than ever, a weaponizing of terms and languages that shut down conversation, usually for political gain, using terms calling out Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, which of course are absolutely legitimate, but sometimes they are also used in order to silence others. And then finally, providing special dietary and other religious needs, as we were hearing before from Halima as well. So moving from those challenges, I'd like to give some headlines about recommendation. As I mentioned, I've got 9 recommendations here. And the first one is very easy for me to say because Halima has also spoken about it. I've used the term context. It's so important. Halima spoke about mapping and landscaping. We're really talking about the same thing. But what we know that what works in one place is often not going to work in another, especially if different religions are dominant. So what works in Sri Lanka or Indonesia or India might be very different for what happens in Africa or the Middle East. And then, of course, I've spoken about continents here, but there are many, many different contexts within those continents. Secondly, religious literacy is extremely important. It's really vitally important to have some knowledge of religious theology and practice when working with religious actors. If you don't know basic beliefs, festival titles, community workings of religious actors, how can you expect to have an adequate conversation, let alone to show respect to the religious actors? And following on that, religious language is very important. And by this, I mean being able to see issues through a religious lens and use language that religious actors feel most comfortable with. Coming to a religious leader with an idea to reform a community is likely to have you out of the door pronto. The possibility of change is more likely through the use of textual references and discussion, rather than an expectation that people will change because of Western logic or what is perceived as or Western values, which are often perceived as Western impositions by others. Fourthly, religious sensitivity. And this is linked to religious knowledge and theology of how you put it into practice. For example, if you want to hold a meeting of religious actors, respect is demonstrated, again, as we heard from Halima, by what food you serve, who is given it religious or are you serving alcohol? If there are people there who do not drink alcohol or are forbidden from drinking alcohol, what time you hold the meeting, will it be in prayer time? Will you give space for prayers during the meeting, not holding it during festivals or on the Sabbath? Who is invited to the meeting? Are you going to have men and women together? Possibly a mixed gender seating might not be customary. Dress codes, as we heard. Also age dynamics, bringing old and young people together. Who is facilitating the meeting, as we heard? How does the person address the participants? Succeeding at all these nuances, as Halima put it, needs knowledge and sensitivity, and together they demonstrate respect. Then fifth, time and space. Values and principles and religions are centuries old. A change of anything is very gradual. Pushing for a quick change is likely to fail. Then we have religious and cultural mores. Religious actors tend to be more conservative in their approach, and sometimes the behavior is culturally rather than religiously based. And this too needs to be considered when engaging effectively. One important recommendation is to find champions in the community who will help you on your path to change. I call them champions. I think this equates with Halima's gatekeepers or doorkeepers, as she mentioned. But people who you can engage with, discuss, who can perhaps be on your side, that agree with the principles you're trying to put across, and then giving them the opportunity to speak for you. And then these last 3 recommendations are after you've done your research, increased your knowledge, and internalized all the above that I've mentioned. First of all, religious actors are also human beings, and they can be guided by interests like anyone else, although it would be worthwhile seeing if those interests align with religious beliefs. And I can bring some examples of that later during question time. It also helps to take an intro-religious approach first, see what's happening inside a particular community. They are not monolithic, so I have different people from the same religion coming together to talk with each other to see if they can find a common voice, a common path, and then bring them together in an interreligious approach with people of other religions, and then a multi-sectoral one to build collaboration, because we do need a whole of society approach. One sector can't do it alone. And then finally, capacity training, because it's important to support religious actors to competently use their natural influence and the values that they share and a passion for peacemaking to advance human development and prosperity. And they also need to learn how to be more inclusive with women and young people and to advocate, and all this can be done through capacity training. So finally, I would just say that in conclusion, there is good news that most religious actors want to be a force for peace, that peace is at the heart of all religions. After all, we have the word salam, shalom, pax, and we at Search have had good successes. So much of the stereotyping and dismissal comes from fears and ignorance that can be dispelled with religious literacy and sensitivity. So I am going to leave it here now, Xander, and I will hand it back to you.
Thank you, Sharon. A few things stuck out. One, I appreciated that you lifted up a lot of the challenges and also started with sort of the why we're working with faith-based organization. And I think for a lot of people joining the call, looking through the list, I know some of you work with religious organizations on a day-to-day basis. I know others of you joining I think a lot of organizations are a bit nervous to engage with religious groups directly. And so they're sort of thinking about how to approach, sort of think of some of those challenges and also sort of the why before we get to the how. I think there are four things that really stuck out. The first one, thinking about timeline, it sort of time horizon. Coming from sort of an advocacy background, we think day to day, week to week, hour to hour. And then sort of in a programmatic peace building or humanitarian or development sense, we think maybe in quarters or maybe in project life cycles. But then when we're talking about working with religious actors, we're talking about generations or centuries. Sharon, you said at one point, sort of interreligious dialogue is new. I was thinking, oh, wow, is it that new? And then you said, it's only a few generations. So to my mind, I think, oh, that's a long time, but really in the grand scheme of things, it's not. And then also, and this is something that both of you lifted up, is sort of thinking about what is religious and what is cultural and what is both and when does that matter? And sort of when are those sort of pulled apart? When are those put together? And how do we approach those? Coming from a baseline that sort of people are people that have all these multitude of identities, but are their own individual, which then leads to the importance of, and I think both of you spoke to this really well, that no group is a monolith, of having to have your conversations sort of interreligious before we can sort of zoom out. Halima, I'll welcome you back to the floor. We have some questions flowing in. I see some hands. Thank you again both for your presentations. We have a while for some discussion with a really good audience here. And I think Nabil, Shama, and Indira have two similar questions that I'll lump together. One question is broadly, where can people find more resources to sort of dig deeper into this? And sort of what are some key ones that people should be looking at? We can include those in the follow-up emails as well. And then the second, and I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on this, is when we think about landscaping or mapping, where do you start? One, And then two, how do you go deeper? I think Khalifa, you talked about like, okay, this region is 67% Muslim, 33% Christian, but that only, the top surface level for many areas. So sorry, those are three big questions. But where to find resources, where to start mapping, and then how to get deeper in mapping. Halima, can we start with you? Sorry, that's a lot to throw in. Okay, go for it.
Thank you for the questions. I think I'm going to talk more on the landscaping, and probably Sharon can talk more on resources. But in terms of where do you start, I think when you know the context where you want to engage, a simple desk review can be a pretty good way to start. Just basic research and displays and the people and the religious demography and how it works. I think basic desk review might be good, but also would be, especially when it comes to going deeper, engaging with people within that context. You cannot do it without engaging with people within the context. And so that is where, like I said earlier, the collaborating with existing faith-based organizations within the community could help. But even if it's not a faith-based organization, community-based organizations, nonprofit, people, individuals who are versed within the context that can give you insider's view can be really helpful. And even in my work, we've had various instances where organizations want to engage within the, like people have issues that they are passionate about. They are aware that, oh, this is, okay, maybe gender inequality is an issue in this place. They are passionate about it. They want to work on it, but they don't know how to start. And they look into the religion, sometimes referrals, asking questions, who is already doing something, who are those within this context that can talk to us and give us some insider information on how things work. Sometimes also some of the organizations or people who are already within the context have resources and network that you can tap into that could make your work easier. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. If some people already have this information, are already working in this context, it's okay to say how much information you can glean from there, and then you know where the gaps are, and then you can start filling it.
Right. Yes, absolutely. What Halima said, we're very lucky at Search for Common Ground. We've got lots of field offices around the world. We're working in over 20 countries on the issues of religious engagement. And we rely very much on our local offices to provide us with information, to do the mapping and to provide the context that we're looking for. And there is nothing that equals, as Halima said, talking to people on the ground to understand what is going on there, and not just one religion, but as many as there are there. In terms of resources, well, as I mentioned, I've been in this position for 8 years, and the first 3 years I spent with help with and religious engagement to develop resources that can provide this sort of information. And they can be found on the Search for Common Ground website. We have a Common Ground approach to religious engagement. And in fact, there is a module on religious sensitivity within the manuals there. They're free, and you can use them as you want. In addition, we developed an online course with the United States Institute of Peace called An Introduction to Religious Peacemaking, a Common Ground Approach, which has many videos and information all about the sort of information that I put across before, the why and the how. And that is also free of charge, and really recommend that you go and use it. It's actually in 3 languages. Our resources are also in 3 languages, in French, Arabic, and English.
Thank you both. And to anyone looking for resources on these subjects, if it's very broad, feel free to email us at ConnexUs or dig around in the thematic action area, where we can also connect you with Halima and Sharon and have a more in-depth question as well. The next question we have in the Q&A is about positionality and reflexivity, asking about when we're working with different let's say I work for an organization that has people of many different faiths. Is it better to have, say, Muslim researchers working with Muslim community leaders and Jewish researchers working with Jewish community leaders? Is there sort of an inherent advantage to that? Or is it sort of better to sort of mix everyone up and sort of do both from a sort of research perspective and a programs side?
Okay. Yes, I think it would depend on the context because we have experience with situations where we would rather do Muslim researcher to Muslim religious actors, Christian researchers to Christian religious actors. Initial engagement helps to build trust, build rapport, clear and is there any hidden agenda behind this? Are they trying to do something or anything like that? I think it just that sense of familiarity makes it easier to build trust. But afterward, other people can be introduced. So in one of our programming, we actually engage the Christian Association of Nigeria to interface and work with the Christian community first, where our organization, which is Muslim faith-based, work with the Muslim organization first. Then after a series of intra-faith engagement, when both sides were sure at a level where they are ready to and able to engage with the other respectfully without any issues, then we can come together. And after that initial interaction, it becomes okay for Christians to engage with Muslims and vice versa without any issue. But sometimes when from the very beginning, a completely strange or different person is coming, it can lead to issues. So if in the context, you understand that these are people who have already been exposed to this kind of engagement and not new to it and would not have any misgivings, and it's okay to engage irrespective of religious differences. But if it is a set of people or a context where this whole endeavor is new to them, then building trust might require using same religion people at the beginning.
And maybe I would just add to that, of course, I agree with Halima. But I would say that we mustn't assume that the Muslim people in our organization know about Islam and that, or that the people of other faiths or born into those faiths know about their faiths. So there is still a need for knowledge acquisition and checking up before you go in. But without a doubt, there is having the building trust is really at the heart of this work. Building trust, showing respect. And normally somebody from the same religion will have a greater sense of familiarity and will kind of know what might be the right way to move forward. So you're less likely to make mistakes. But I would hope that quite quickly after that first initial move forward has been made and the relationships have been built, that then you can bring others into the fold, into the discussion.
Yeah, I'm hearing from both of you, this was underscored in your presentations of sort of context, knowledge, but then the importance of relationships and sort of who can introduce you to whom, who has what relationship with each other. Thank you both. Fee, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you, Sharon and Halima. The question I have is based on the engagement with people of same faith with actors as well. And again, for me, I'm kind of thinking about the complexities of that, given the different ways of practicing and the differences at times as well. So it becomes quite complex, doesn't it? So, yeah. And I was wondering, how do you then manage that complexity? Because everybody, in groups, and there's so many different denominations and different ways of practicing in different religions, then how do you match who works with who and how that initial kind of introduction begins? Sorry, I don't know whether I made that question quite clear. Yeah.
It is complex. I think you chose the right word there. I think that's why we're holding a webinar here to talk about those complexities. Because you can make a mistake. I mean, I wouldn't say that if you make a mistake, then that's the end of it. But there are different denominations, and I think that's why Halima and I are so emphasizing this issue of do your homework first, do your landscaping, do your mapping, check your context, and see who could be the right person to go in first. Or it might not even be one person, it could be a couple of people, but have somebody who is leading it, who knows what they're saying, what they're talking about. And I think another thing is that at the beginning, although you might make a meeting with somebody with a religious act or a religious leader, I think that the first part of that meeting needs to be a sense of, building the relationship, getting to know the other, listening rather than talking, and getting a sense of where the person you're talking to is before you start talking about why you're going to be there.
Thank you.
Yeah, in addition to that, I think also agreeing on some common ground rules could be helpful from the very beginning when you have people even within the same faith. And that is why usually in our work, we usually emphasize adequate and effective intra-faith engagement before interfaith engagement. And we have found this to be very useful. Sometimes the problem about people having misgivings, prejudice against people that they think are different from them is just because they do not have the opportunity to interact with them and get to know them better and their viewpoints. And just having that safe space to discuss, to understand why do you see things the way you do, what are the evidence, what are the textual references. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will change their own position, but it just means that sometimes they understand where the other person is coming from and they can agree to disagree and decide what are some out of bounds, things we shouldn't get to, things we understand. This is your position, this is my position. I'm not going to change, you're not going to change. But what are those common things that we can agree on? What are the common challenges that we both agree is for public benefit, is for the good of everybody if we can address this and we focus on addressing that, and whether it is within the same religious group or between different religious groups, we have found this approach to be very effective in our work, and perhaps it is something that you may be able to adapt as you deal with this complexity.
Thank you, Halima. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I just come back on one thing as a result of what Halima said? I want to go back to what I said about interests as well, finding common interests, because, or not even common interests, but actually the people we're talking to also have interests. And that's why it's so important to listen to hear what those interests are. Because if you can tap into the interests of the people that you're speaking with, you're already more likely to be able to find a way towards answering those interests and then finding that common ground that you're looking for. So yeah, that's basically what I wanted to add.
Thank you both for your presentations and for fielding so many questions. I know I say this on every webinar, but it's so fun to look at the list and see where everyone is coming from and the organization and the different expertise that's in a room at any one time. Looking through, we have at least 13 time zones covered right now. So thank you all, whether you're up early in the morning or still up late at night. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your experience. I'm very excited to go back through this recording. We'll share it out with all of you, have it on ConnexUs, to sort of have another take to bring in this information. But if either of you have last thoughts, something that you wanted to work into the conversation but didn't get a chance, now's your chance. If not, we'll close it here.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just to underscore the importance of sensitivity in our engagement with religious leaders, not just to ensure that we do not lose them, but also to ensure that we do not even take one step forward and 5 steps backward. Sometimes we really need to get buy-in. We know the value of what we're trying to do, but if people that within the context do not see it, they may actually make all the effort we're putting into that go into a waste. We've had situations where an organization is doing a project that is very good for girls' education and empowerment, but just because of how it was raised, the name that it was called, and not carrying religious leaders along, it was misunderstood as a way of drawing girls to feminism, and religious leaders went up against it, and the whole project, despite all the investment, was not successful. So such a result could have been avoided if only the religious leaders had been effectively engaged. So where we know that they hold such kind of influence in the context we're working with, as complex, as challenging as it may be, I think it would be rewarding in the long run if we can engage them effectively.
Maybe I can just add that we have spoken about all the complexities and the difficulties and how much knowledge you need. But I would like to leave on a hopeful note or a positive note to say that really most religious leaders that I've met really do want to help, really want to support their communities, want to create possibilities and for their communities, opportunities, make their lives better. And that is really what we can tap into because they are a force for peace.
Thank you both. Beautifully put. You've covered the challenges, the opportunities, the important, all of it. So thank you again to each of you and for all of you for joining us. We'll see you at the next session. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.